But we're going to continue our regular adult Bible study here, which takes the book of Acts and the sermons in Acts and kind of supplements those and fills those out, takes material that I was not able to fit well into the sermon and gives you some background. And so that's what we continue this morning. Our text is Acts 8, verses 26 through 40. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Rise and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert place." And he rose and went, and there was an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning, seated in his chariot, and he was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over and join this chariot." Acts 8, verse 30. So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and asked, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And he said, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Now the passage of the scripture that he was reading was this: "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb before its shearers is silent, so he opens not his mouth. In his humiliation justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." And the eunuch said to Philip, "About whom, I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else?" Then Philip opened his mouth, and beginning with this scripture, he told him the good news about Jesus. And as they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "See, here is water. What prevents me from being baptized?" And he commanded the chariot to stop. And they both went down into the water, Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. And when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. But Philip found himself at Azotus, and as he passed through, he preached the gospel to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. Okay, there is a lot in this passage, and remember, though, that we had Philip earlier in Acts 8, right? We had Next Step Sunday in between, and actually in Acts 8, there's kind of a parenthesis in the middle that makes it easy to forget. But remember Acts 8, verse 4, those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed to them the Christ. So you had Philip to Samaria, and then Philip sent by the Lord south to this man who's been traditionally called the Ethiopian eunuch. Poor guy. What a thing to be defined by. I'm going to call him the treasurer today, because that's what he was, and it's nicer than calling him the eunuch 100 times in a Sunday morning. So let's talk about him. He is, first of all, a wealthy and powerful official. There's actually debate about whether he was really a eunuch or not, because by the first century, the term had almost become synonymous with treasurer, since anybody who worked that closely in the midst of the palace was probably made a eunuch. But he is called both things here, so he was apparently both a eunuch and a cabinet member. I mean, he's like the minister of finance in this kingdom. And the kingdom is what historians would call the Nubian Empire. And there's this woman that you have the name Candace there. Candace isn't actually a name. Candace is like Pharaoh or Caesar. It's a title for the queen mother. And everybody knew in that empire she was the one who had all the power. I don't know what the term was, but the other president or whatever was more of a figurehead. And she was the one with all the power. So he was the treasurer for the Candace, the one who had all the authority in that empire. And so that itself ought to make us stop and pause, because what we have here is the salvation of a wealthy and powerful official. And that's important for me, because when you think about this man being a eunuch, what comes to mind for me is kind of like a lowly little slave. And that is not at all the case with this man. This is a very important man. He is taking a journey from his country, south of Egypt, down into Sudan probably, to Israel that would take 5 months each way to get there through the middle of nowhere. So he has a tremendous amount of money. This is a very, very rich man to go take a trip like this to go try to worship the God of the Jews. So let's have that in mind as we think about him. But secondly, he is an African. The word Ethiopia here doesn't refer to the country of Ethiopia that we would think of today, which is kind of, if you go from Egypt south to Sudan, then Ethiopia is out to the east a little bit. He's from the, how do you say it? Down the Nile River, but that's actually up the Nile River, right? Up the Nile River, south, the bottom of Egypt, down into maybe the middle of modern day Sudan. So what does that mean about him? What did he look like? What did he look like? He was black. He was an African. There's some slight possibility that he was not, but that would be very unusual. So he is, there's argument about whether we should call him a Gentile or not, because he had a lot of contact with Judaism, apparently. I don't get that argument. I say he's a Gentile, and he's probably the first Gentile saved in the book of Acts. And who is he? He's a really rich, powerful African. Isn't that cool? It just doesn't fit what we think of as how the gospel works and whatever. It makes me think of, who were the first witnesses to the resurrection? Women. That's right. Who's the first Gentile contact in the convert that we know of in the book of Acts? A black man from the middle of Africa who's a wealthy cabinet official. God has no boundaries like human beings do. I love that. He is an African, and he is from the, here, the way I wrote that in my notes is, one of the things about that is, there is no third world from God's viewpoint. We think of the world in those categories, and God sees no such thing. He is also from the ends of the earth. What happens as you go from Israel south? What are you headed toward? Sorry, it's not a trick question. You're headed toward the equator. You're headed down into the desert, further and further, and you're headed closer and closer. So he's 1,000 miles closer to the equator than you would be from the top of Egypt. So somebody said, to Luke's readers in the first century, Ethiopia would have been the extreme boundary of the habitable world in the hot south, and it sometimes may have even been called the ends of the earth. So this is the salvation of a wealthy and powerful black official from the ends of the known earth. Then he was also a God-fearer, though possibly unable to be a full proselyte. So one of the mysteries about this man is, how did he know about the God of Israel? Somehow he had some connection that made him want to come to Jerusalem and worship this God. So what would be our first guess as to how he knows about the God of Israel? What do we know about the Jewish people? Chris? Well, that's possible, though that's a long time ago. That's 1,000 years before this, but it's definitely possible. What would be a much more recent development? Yeah? What about the Jewish people, though? Scattered, right? Scattered throughout that empire. It's actually the Greek Empire would be part of the answer because they ruled down into Egypt, right? So Greek culture, but then the scattering of the Jewish people is probably the best answer. We know they were scattered all over the known world. So somehow this treasurer had learned about the God of Israel and had respect for the God of Israel. So can you think of somebody else in the Bible he might be like? He'd fit in the same category. Maybe the wise men. How about Cornelius? How about Rahab? When you heard about the God of Israel and thought well of the God of Israel, but didn't really know him. So I think he fits into a category that the Bible calls God-fearers. But then there's another category that we could call proselytes. They would be like full converts to Judaism, people who converted. But what was this man's problem with being a full proselyte? He was a eunuch, right? And so there were a whole bunch of parts of Jewish worship that the law of Moses said he couldn't participate in. So he's a God-fearer, though possibly unable to be a full proselyte. Now that makes some Old Testament prophecies really interesting. So will you turn with me and let's just look. We're not going to look at context here, but just a couple references. Go to Zephaniah, which is a little hard to find. Four from the end of your Old Testament. What we're trying to do here is really put some life, help us see and picture and imagine this person so that we might wonder at what the grace of God did and really thrill at what the Spirit of God was doing, because I think that's what's supposed to happen in Acts chapter 8. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 10. This is the heading of this paragraph in the ESV says, the conversion of the nations. And verse 10 says, from beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshipers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. So I don't know exactly what that means, but Cush is the Old Testament word for that Nubian empire, or Ethiopia, in Acts chapter 8. And so here you have worshipers coming from beyond the rivers of Cush, and somehow they're the daughter of God's dispersed ones. So I don't know if that could indicate, like we were talking about, that the dispersion goes and talks about Israel's God, and then those people end up coming to worship that God. That's what it sounds like. And so you see there, is that a hint of what was going to happen with this Ethiopian treasure? Go over to Psalm 68. What is our beeping noise? Is that in the hallway?
It's the lift.
It's the lift. Did you tell him we got important stuff to do in here?
Sorry, Pastor.
I'll just talk louder. Psalm 68 and verse 31. Nobles shall come from Egypt. Cush shall hasten to stretch out her hands to God. O kingdoms of the earth, sing to God, sing praises to the Lord. Oh, it's just kind of it's almost a random reference there in the midst of this picture of God working and the people, the nations coming to him. But there's another reference to Cush, down below Egypt, those people hastening to stretch out their hands to God. Then go back to 1 Kings chapter 8. And let's remember what Solomon prayed at the dedication of the temple. 1 Kings 8, verse 41. So this is Solomon praying. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake, for they shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand and of your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays toward this house, here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name. I think God answered Solomon's prayer. 1,000 years later. It was one of many, many, many answers to Solomon's prayer. But God answered Solomon's prayer when this Ethiopian came. What do you think he prayed for? I don't know, but what we know is when that treasurer came to Jerusalem, he spent probably a tremendous sum of money to buy his own Isaiah scroll. So this man is hungry. And I don't know about you, but I would not read an Isaiah scroll bouncing in a chariot on a desert road very well. When I read, I want to be in my cushy chair with my soccer ball blanket on my lap and everything quiet and my earplugs in, even if I'm the only person in the house, so that I can focus. But this man has his Isaiah scroll in a chariot in the desert, and he is trying to figure this thing out. So what did he pray when he came to Jerusalem? Surely he's praying something like, God, I need to know who you are. I want to know you. And I'm going to mention this in the next service, but he went to Jerusalem, and it looks like he left Jerusalem empty-handed. Like God didn't answer his prayer, but God had an answer to his prayer coming. And it's not just his prayer, it's all the way back to Solomon, who said, God, when these people come to your temple, answer whatever they pray for. And God did that. So I have a quote there from commentary on the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. Although there is no allusion to these passages, like they're not directly referred to in Acts 8, we do have the phenomenon of echoes that might be picked up by the alert reader. What is promised in the Old Testament now finds fulfillment. And so here's what this really means in the bigger context of the book of Acts. What's happening in the early chapters of Acts is evidence after evidence after evidence that Jesus really is the one the Old Testament scriptures promised. And this is another evidence of that. Because the Old Testament scriptures promised that the people from Cush would come to Jerusalem seeking this God. And I didn't include the reference here, but it also promised in Isaiah 56 that the eunuchs would receive an everlasting name that would not be cut off. And here those things are finding their fulfillment, not in Jerusalem, but through this Christian who knows Jesus out on this desert road. So it's another evidence that the Old Testament prophecies are finding their fulfillment in Jesus. All right, does that give some life to that man for you? Any questions about that? Okay, I want to mention then, just to jump to two other things here. First of all, quickly, the significance of verse 37. If you look in Acts 8 again, if you go back to Acts 8, all right, who has verse 37? Some people. Who has a footnote to verse 37? Who has verse 37 in italics? Yeah? Or in brackets, okay? So the King James says, and Philip said, if thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. So this is an answer to the eunuch saying, what prevents me from being baptized? And so in the KJV it reads, Philip said, if thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And then verse 38 commanded the chariot to stop, and they went down and were baptized. So most other translations either italicize it or put it in brackets or put it in a footnote. And remember that the King James is based off of the Greek text that came originally from Erasmus, and Erasmus had fewer than 10 manuscripts to work with when he did that, late manuscripts. Now, as we've talked about, it is remarkably accurate despite that, but occasionally you come across a place where we see the weaknesses of Erasmus's manuscripts, and this is one of those. It's quite evident that these words were added to manuscripts several centuries after Luke wrote the book of Acts, and it's easy to see why, because without verse 37, it looks kind of like an easy believism. Like he says, hey, why can't I get baptized? And Philip says, great, go for it. And somebody could say, wait. We don't know anything about what this man believes or professes. So it seems like a scribe at some point inserted a profession of faith here. Now that is completely unnecessary because the story doesn't pretend to tell us everything. And what we know is that Philip told him the gospel of Jesus, starting with Isaiah 53. So he knows the gospel. And surely Philip understands repentance and faith and baptism, so I don't think it needed to be inserted. But here's what's actually more interesting. The words in verse 37 are actually words that we have all the way back in second century Christian literature as a baptism formula used in Christian services. So actually what that scribe wrote in there gives us a little window into how the early church baptized people. Apparently, in baptism services, they would have this kind of question and answer method where the person would then publicly profess their belief in Jesus as a response to a kind of like it's not exactly a question. Philip says, if you believe with all your heart, you may. It's kind of a dialogue between the baptizer and the person being baptized as they profess their faith. So verse 37 actually gives us kind of a window into the early church and how they were baptizing, and it connects to why we as a church always ask anybody getting baptized to give a public testimony together with that baptism. All right, let's jump to something else here then and talk a little bit about something we're going to talk about more in the next service. To see what that is, I need you to go to Acts 21. I mean, it's in your handout, but pretend for a moment that you didn't look at your handout yet. Philip shows up in Acts chapter 8, and then there's just one mention of him. Paul and Luke visited Philip. By the way, how did Luke know about Philip? Maybe, how did he know about what happened in Acts 8? It's probably Philip told him. Because 20 years later, Acts chapter 21, verse 8, Luke writes, on the next day we departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip, the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. Caesarea. You know how Acts 8 ended? It said Philip preached the gospel to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. So apparently, Philip settled in Caesarea, and 20 years later or so, Luke and Paul came and stayed in his house. But notice here what Philip is called. He's called the evangelist. Now, that's really intriguing because we've got just 2 other uses of the term evangelist in the New Testament. And I'm going to introduce this in the next few minutes, and I'm going to frustrate you because you're going to be hoping that I will give you some clear definition or answer, and I'm not going to. We're just going to kind of look at some of the evidence and then maybe piece together a couple more things in the next service. So I apologize in advance for frustrating you for the next 10 minutes. There are 2 other uses of the word evangelist. They're in your handout. Ephesians 4, Christ gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. And then on the back of your handout, 2 Timothy 4:5, Paul writes to Timothy, as for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. So, do Ephesians 4 or 2 Timothy 4 tell us what an evangelist is or what an evangelist does? No, they don't tell us anything, really. So, does Acts 21:8 tell us who an evangelist is or what an evangelist does? Not really. It just tells us that Philip was one. So, the conclusion I come to is Acts 8 tells us what an evangelist is and what an evangelist does. That's not really profound, but I think that's an important conclusion. But let's dig around about this for a little bit. Why? Because we care greatly about the gospel going. And if Jesus has gifted people with evangelism or gifted people as evangelists, then we want to know about that. And we've got to nurture that, and that's got to be important for us. So what is this? What does this mean? So first of all, a little church history, and there's an article from Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary by William Combs that I'm depending on for a lot of this material. Church history, in the early church, the term evangelist seems to have been used only occasionally, and when it did, it was used mostly for missionaries. So really the first use we know of the term is for missionaries. Then, from about the 400s through the 1700s, look at all of our Christian literature, and you just very rarely ever have the word show up. If it shows up, it was usually used to refer to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the writers of the Gospels. So for 1,300 years of church history, evangelists primarily referred to the writers of the Gospels or other early church planters. In other words, if you asked Luther or Calvin or somebody like that at the time of the Reformation about an evangelist, they would say those people were back in the first century helping found the Christian church. Or they would have said, right, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John were the evangelists. That was the prevailing view for a very long time in church history. So, 1700s, you have people like John Wesley and George Whitefield who never referred to themselves as evangelists. Never used that term. And Wesley never used that term for any of his traveling preachers. It just was not a word that was used. But then, in the 1800s, through Charles Finney and men like him, the term began to be applied to preachers who do revival meetings, traveling preachers who speak at services that are focused on reaching unsaved people. And so that became really the predominant use of the term, and the term evangelist has been all over our news for the last 3 weeks. Why is that? Billy Graham. And when most Americans today think of an evangelist, they think immediately of Billy Graham. And that fits into kind of the way the term's been used for the past couple hundred years of American history. So the bottom line is church history doesn't help us much. It's kind of foggy and confusing because there hasn't been a lot of clarity on what it means. There's also another thing we do to try to figure out what something means is we go look at how the word's used in other Greek literature, like how did ancient Greek people use the term evangelist? And the answer is they didn't. We've got like one use we know of outside the New Testament. So that doesn't help us. Remember I told you I was going to frustrate you here? That doesn't help us. Church history doesn't really help us. But let's note some things in the New Testament. First of all, here in Acts 21, the term is used very intentionally. And here's what I mean. You might remember that there was an apostle named Philip. And so we might think, well, this Philip is called the evangelist, just so you'll know he's not the apostle. So maybe it doesn't mean that much. Maybe it's just distinguishing him from the apostle. But look at Acts 21, verse 8 with me. What is there in Acts 21, verse 8 that makes it clear that that's not the case? Yeah, it says he was one of the 7. It already tells us that he was one of those deaconish people from Acts chapter 6. And it tells us that he was the evangelist. So it's important that he's called the evangelist in Acts 21. Let's also note that the events of Acts 21 happened about 20 years after the events of Acts 8 in the same place where Philip ended up in Acts 8. I mentioned that earlier. Acts 8 ends with Philip in Caesarea, and 20 years later, Philip's in Caesarea. So what happened in between? I don't know, but it means that it's possible Philip actually settled down in that city. And so whatever it meant for him to be an evangelist, it didn't mean that he had to be traveling. He may well have stayed in Caesarea, which was an important coastal city for those decades. Our next point here is that Philip was one of the serving 7 in the Jerusalem church. When you read Acts 8, you can't forget Acts 6. We can't forget that Philip was willing to serve Christian widows in the Jerusalem church. So when we think of an evangelist, you might think of somebody who doesn't have any patience for the inner workings of a local church. They don't have any time to get bogged down with stuff like mercy ministry and caring for Christians and things. But yet Philip was willing to daily serve food to the widows. So that helps us see that whatever an evangelist is, it's a person with a heart for the local church. Then we see next that Philip scattered to share the gospel, partly from necessity and the Spirit's initiative. So we want to think together through what the Bible is telling us about the motivations here. Why is Philip out on the road? Why is Philip on the move? It's partly because he just got kicked out of Jerusalem, right? So we might think of an evangelist as somebody who, by their nature, wants to go with the gospel, and that may be true. But Philip scattered by persecution, by his brothers and sisters getting killed in Jerusalem for the gospel. But at the same time, it's the Spirit that sends Philip to this Ethiopian. It's the Spirit that sends Philip to Azotus and up to Caesarea. So the motivations don't necessarily, maybe they come from kind of inside Philip himself, but there's this external thing God's doing, pushing him out through the persecution. And then there's the work of the Spirit that he's responding to and being compelled along. The next thing we observe, and I'm back to Acts 8 now actually, the next thing we see is that Philip did signs and great miracles. That's what Acts 8:13 tells us. So does an evangelist have to be somebody who does signs and great miracles? Well, I think we could say they could be. The only people, though, that the New Testament says have to do signs and great miracles would be the apostles. That was a sign of apostleship. So they had to as proof of their apostleship. Other people like Philip could, as God sovereignly determined, for the spread of the gospel. The next thing we see here is that Philip baptized. He baptized in Samaria, and then he baptized the treasurer. And so an evangelist has got to be somebody who understands the importance of baptism as a public profession of repentance and faith. Then we have Ephesians 4. All I'm doing is just giving you little pieces of evidence right now. I know it's scattered. Then we have Ephesians 4. Ephesians 4:11 lists 5 types of spiritually gifted people, which grammatically should be understood like this. Christ gave some apostles and some prophets, and those are the 2 that back in Ephesians, earlier in Ephesians, are said to be the ones who laid the foundation of the church, the foundation of the apostles and prophets. So some apostles and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and other teachers. And what that phrase indicates is that all pastors teach, but there are other teachers who are not pastors. Some pastors and other teachers. So, does that verse mean that there is a gift of evangelism? And does that verse mean that evangelist is a church office like pastor? What do you think about those 2 questions, regardless of what your handout says? Just looking at Ephesians 4:11, it's there on the first page of your handout, right? Does that verse say that there's a gift of evangelism? Does it indicate that evangelist is a church office like pastor? It's not a trick. I'm just asking to look at what the text says. Which one?
Seems like it is. It's saying the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers to equip. Unless it's just saying the pastors and teachers to equip. But it
Well, certainly the evangelists have an equipping role. Or they're part of the building up of the church, at least, right? So that's true. Are they an office? Is everything in Ephesians 4:11 a church office? No, everything's not. Prophets don't seem to be a church office. Other teachers wouldn't be a church office. So not necessarily everything there is an official church office. Does it say there's a gift of evangelism? I know you see my answer on the page. I'm just asking you to interact with the text. It doesn't say that, right? Evangelism isn't listed as a gift anywhere in the New Testament, but it's just suggested there, right? If Christ gave to the church some evangelists as his gifting, then I do think that suggests that there's something God's doing there in that person. So I don't really have a problem with referring to a gift of evangelism, even though the New Testament doesn't actually say that. And then there's 2 Timothy 4, verse 5. You see that at the top of your handout? Paul says to Timothy, do the work of an evangelist. And that's interpreted two ways. Either that means that Timothy was an evangelist himself, and Paul's saying to Timothy, hey, you need to get back to being an evangelist like you were with me. Or else it means, more generally, Paul's speaking to Timothy like to a pastor and saying, you need to make sure you do the work of an evangelist, whether or not you're an evangelist yourself. And I really think that second understanding is the better way to understand that. I think Paul's saying to Timothy, okay, so Timothy traveled with Paul, then settles down in Ephesus, and Paul writes him and says, Timothy, do the work of an evangelist. Timothy, you know what that's like. You were out there with me, right? We were taking the gospel to new places. Now you've settled down here and you're pastoring, but never stop doing the work of an evangelist. And I would even say that I think that should apply to all of us, to every Christian. I think to every Christian we can say, never stop doing the work of an evangelist. There may be people whom we could refer to as an evangelist in their gifting from God, but all of us should never stop seeking to do that work. Does that make sense? I think that would be a fair way to understand 2 Timothy 4:5. All right, so what I've done there is just try to show you the Bible evidence. Now, you take that and you can see why there have been disagreements in church history about what an evangelist is, because that doesn't nail it down and give us any clear definition, but it does give us some key pieces. One other thing we should mention, and that is, what does the word itself mean? That was on your handout somewhere, wasn't it? We skipped it. It's the second bullet point. As used in the New Testament, the word seems to mean to proclaim the good news about Jesus Christ to non-Christians. There's only one place in the New Testament where it could refer to preaching the gospel to Christians. And even that's Romans 1, where Paul says he wants to preach the gospel to them who are in Rome also. So it's just pretty much exclusively used for proclaiming the gospel to non-Christians. So whatever the evangelist is, we've got some really key pieces. It is about telling the gospel to non-Christians. It does include a heart for the local church. It does involve giftedness from the Lord. It does include an understanding of the importance of something like baptism. It is part of what Christ has given to the church so that the whole church might be built up into maturity, into the fullness of Christ, like he says in Ephesians chapter 4. And there's some sense in which all of us probably need to be doing the work of an evangelist. Now, having said all that, I still think we haven't actually talked about the main Bible information, which is Acts 8. Because if we're supposed to figure out what an evangelist is, Acts 21 says Philip's one of them. So what did Philip do in Acts 8? That, I think, gives us the best picture of what the evangelist is, and so that's what we will explore more in the next service.